Invisible hero. He was just a cook and a delivery driver, until one night he smelled something that made him move faster than fear. Tell me what city you're watching from in the comments. Carlos Menddees had learned to live in the margins and make them feel like solid ground. He kept 2 lives in his pockets, one measured in orders fulfilled and tips earned, the other counted in folded bills, tucked away for a single stubborn dream. During the day he was steady hands over a stove, the kind of cook whose rhythm took the shape of knives and pans. At night he rode a bike through the city, a knapsack of food over his shoulder, the glow of streetlights catching the sweat on his brow. He came from Guatemala, and he carried that country with him in the recipes he knew by heart, in the names of spices, in the way he folded tortillas. His accents were quiet and exact, words practiced over years across unfamiliar registers. He woke early when other people were still finishing sleep. He tightened the chain on his bicycle, checked the delivery apps, and made a habit of leaving before the city fully woke. He was invisible by design, no uniform that caught attention, no headline, no polished pitch. Invisible to the commuter who only noticed the road when it was blocked, invisible to the people who paid for his food and never learned his name. That invisibility had its dignity. It paid rent. It bought flour sacks and lids for a pot. It bought him the slow accumulation of money toward a front window and a small sign that would one day say his name above an oven. On a Saturday evening in late winter, the neighborhood hummed the way it always did, the low rattle of buses, the distant thump of a club, a radio turning up through an open window. The building where he made his pickup was the kind of place that kept many lives stacked and layered, families in small apartments, elderly people who greeted the day with a cup of coffee at a window, newcomers like Carlos who arrived and left with the city's rhythm. He clipped his helmet, locked his bicycle for a minute while he grabbed an order, and stepped into a hallway that smelled faintly of cooking oil and perfume. The delivery was routine, the kind he could do with his eyes almost closed. Then there was a different smell, not the sharp hot smoke he'd smelled before in kitchens, not the burnt sugar of a pan left too long. This was a flat, oily odor that floated along the hallway and pooled under doors. It was a smell you noticed only because everything else seemed normal. It made the hair on his arms lift. Then he heard it, a thin, persistent hiss, like air escaping from a tire. It came from somewhere behind a wall, softened but distinct in the quiet. Carlos stopped. He ran his hand along the banister, and the wood felt at once ordinary and electric. He checked the pilot lights of a stove in a dim kitchen while he waited on the landing. A low blue flame burned as usual.
Down the corridor, a neighbor's heater clicked, and then, neither louder nor quieter, it seemed to settle into the building like a held breath. He smelled the gas again, stronger now, and his mouth went dry. He did what anyone might do first. He called. He dialed 911 with fingers that did not tremble as much as his heart did. The operator answered. Someone was coming, he was told. How long? Indefinido. The voice on the line was calm, professional. It spoke in sequences and reassurances that sounded reassuring in the abstract and thin in the throat. There were procedures, and they would be followed. Help would arrive. Carlos listened to that and felt the gulf between words and the thinness of time. The sound of the hiss was quickening in his ears. In instances like this, minutes stretched like rope. He thought about waiting. He thought about the rooftop smokers and the people who sometimes left candles burning in a window. He thought about the deliveries he still had to make and the money on his phone screen like a promise. This was when the invisible made a choice to step into the light. He did not announce a plan. He moved. He left the ordered food on a counter and pushed into the hallway, knocking on the first door he saw. There was a mother inside speaking to her child. When the door opened, he told her, without flourish, that there was gas in the building and they needed to get out. He did not say, "I will save you." He said plainly, insistently, "Get everyone out now." When a door was slow to open, he knocked harder. When someone said they didn't want to leave because they didn't know what would happen to their apartment, he told them the truth. He didn't know either. He only knew this: the smell, the hiss, the way metal in the stairwell had already started to sing. The mother hesitated, then turned, gathering a toddler, a neighbor's elderly man that leaned on a cane, a teenager with headphones unplugged now. Carlos's voice moved them like a current that passed through the building, practical, urgent, short sentences that cut through panic. He went door to door, across a corridor of apartments that held in their thin spaces
lives and memories and the ordinary clutter of human living. He opened door after door, sometimes gentle, sometimes brusque, sometimes shouting if he had to. Gas, he'd say. Come out. Now. That was all he had, and it was everything. A neighbor who had been sitting on a couch rose slowly, as if roused from a dream. A woman in slippers grabbed a photo on the way out, and then let it fall because the child was crying, and the child had to be outside. Outside, the sidewalk was still lit by street lamps, and the air tasted colder and clearer. People came into the street like a slow, spreading tide. Shoes scraped on concrete. Calls and questions made the air smaller for a moment. What's going on? Is it safe? Stay back.
Some neighbors stood under coat collars, heads bent against the wind. Others sat on stoops and watched with phone screens in their hands, their faces pale in the glow. A few held pets, wrapped in towels or hands. Cars passed slowly, and the driver offered a look of confusion, then moved on. Nearby storefronts flicked their lights uncertainly. Carlos realized quickly that the smell was not confined to one building. It threaded out, a faint ghost reaching 20, 30, 50 feet, maybe more. Doorways from adjacent buildings were open now, residents drawn by the commotion. Voices multiplied. He shouted for people to back up, as if the distance might hold danger at bay. He could have stepped aside. He could have explained to the operator that the buildings were full and that the hiss grew louder. He could have watched from the perimeter. Instead, he climbed the stairwell into another building and went up floor by floor, calling out the same frantic refrain. He moved with a pace that made the stairs a blur, taking them two at a time when he could. His breath came in sharp pulls now. The hiss filled stairwells, and the metal of the railing warmed beneath his palms. On the third floor, a door opened to reveal an elderly man with beads of sweat on his brow, confusion in his eyes. He used a cane. He lived on his own. He had taken pride in his rugs and the neat place where he kept his shoes lined perfectly. Carlos did not ask him to explain himself. He offered an arm, and the man took it, surprised and distrustful, and then convinced by the firmness of that hand. They descended together, one step at a time, the stairwell seeming to lean with the sound of the city. At the bottom, a child was on the landing of the next building, her grandmother tense and holding her tightly. The child refused to leave the building at first, fears small and absolute, but loosened when Carlos crouched to speak to her, bringing his voice to a level that the child could recognize as a promise. He did not make grand promises. He drew her attention to a stuffed animal and promised that it would be safe. The grandmother took the girl's hand, and the three of them emerged into a crowd that had grown denser and more chaotic. Time multiplied and shrunk. Cars stopped nearby as neighbors called for lights to remain on and for people to stand further back. Someone banged on the hood of a car to get the driver's attention and asked to turn off an engine because the vibration could be dangerous. Someone else, already gathered on a stoop, shouted about candles. A man in a suit fussed with his phone, making a call, while next to him a young woman wrapped in a borrowed sweater tried to comfort a dog that had gone rigid and small. The building's superintendent, when he finally arrived, looked like a man who had been part of the building for longer than anyone else, keys jangling, face set. He moved with the rusty authority of someone used to small emergencies.
Carlos relayed what he had smelled and heard, how it had started, how the hiss had crawled. The superintendent's jaw worked. He admitted uncertainty. He called a number, then another, and his voice carried a fatigue that comes from repeated calls met by indifferent processes. For all the noise, there was a peculiar order to the evacuation. It had the logic of people who had been ordered to leave a restaurant in a fire drill and took with them their most precious. The old and the small first, then the rest in loose clusters. Carlos found himself collecting the scattered. A man with a bad shoulder helped down the aisle, a mother with 3 small children hushed into a jacket. He watched as the building emptied, and saw in each face the vault of ordinary things they were letting go. He was not alone in doing this. Neighbors helped neighbors. 2 teenagers, at first indifferent to the commotion, became clearing hands, waving people from lobbies. A woman who had only minutes before been arguing with a neighbor about rent was now passing out blankets. The city's invisible threads, delivery drivers, night nurses, baristas, retired teachers, revealed themselves in an instant, woven together by a hazard that refused to discriminate. The number of people gathered in the street began to feel like more than a single building could hold. They flowed like a current along the block, stretching into adjacent corners and outside a corner store. Carlos tried to keep count in his head and gave up. He estimated, loudly, that the number might be near 200. He didn't insist on exactness. He used the phrase approximately 200 as both a shock and a fact. The number held as a kind of gravity. It gave the moment scale. People clutched coats and children and papers. Phones recorded in small fluorescent sprung angles. Phones, as they always do now, became a chorus.
Someone raised a phone and the tiny screen captured Carlos running between doorways, his silhouette quick and purposeful. That clip would later spin outward, a viral thread that made him visible to strangers beyond the block. But in that instant it was simply documentation, a neighbor's attempt to show someone what was happening. The clip flickered in the hands of others and was passed from hand to hand, widening its reach. A woman with a camera angle from a fire escape captured him moving through the crowd like a point of light. For a moment there was panic. One of the apartment windows above rattled and a loud metallic clank turned the crowd's attention to a different end of the block. A shout from someone near the building's back entrance said a smell like rotten eggs had gotten stronger. People looked at each other and then farther up the street as if looking for a decision to lead them. Then the first flash of red in the distance came into view, the kind of siren that means organized response is finally close.
People turned toward it, and a collective sigh pulled through the crowd like a wave that lifted chins and rearranged priorities. Carlos, who had been running from doorway to doorway, paused to catch his breath. He pressed a palm to his chest and felt his heart tripping. He had been breathing in thin measures for some time. His chest felt like a kettle about to whistle. He thought about the operator's voice on the line and about how long the siren had taken in the city's logic. He thought about how speed can sometimes be a stranger to the apparatus of official arrival. The siren grew nearer, and the air felt like a held note ready to drop. First responders, firefighters in dark coats, helmets gleaming, jumped from their truck and shouted instructions. They brought with them equipment that smelled of oil and clean metal, faces set in the professional calm of trained hands. Their arrivals shifted the field. They took over the perimeter, asked questions, fired orders that threaded through the crowd like directives. Carlos stepped back but did not step away. He told the firefighters what he had smelled and where he had checked for the source. He pointed toward several buildings, toward stairwells, toward the places where the hiss had been loudest. The commanders listened with the focus of people who have learned to make quick assessments in the middle of noise. They moved with the practiced steps of those who had been taught to accept and to act. They began to coordinate, some men setting up caution tape, others calling for the utility company to dispatch a crew. A technician would need to locate the shutoff, they said. They couldn't do that without assessing the valve and the line and the pressure. The word line was technical and dry inside the cacophony, and a degree of indefinite hung around it. The exact source of the leak, what had failed, whether it had been a pipe in the street or a connection in a basement, indefinite. For now, the mission was to get people gone and to hold the perimeter until it was safe. A neighbor collapsed onto the stoop, suddenly pale and then relieved when a medic knelt and checked pulse and breathing. Carlos watched the small scene and felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with pride. He felt the body's immediate fatigue press against him, lungs filled with the chill night air, a taste of metal in the back of his throat from the time he'd been inside a hallway that whispered with gas. He had not counted the cost of being the person who moved first, only done it because it needed doing. He felt a new kind of dizziness, as if the night itself had tilted. There was one sharp moment that seared itself into the crowd's memory. A woman in the middle of the sidewalk realized her elderly neighbor was missing. She pointed to a window and let out a sound that was part plea and part command. Carlos reacted before the sirens had finished their cry.
He cut across the pavement, legs pumping, breath a metronome, and darted down the building's side where a back entrance gave access to stairwells less traveled. He had to go through a narrow service corridor into a stairwell that smelled of bleach and old paper. The dim emergency light threw his shadow long and brittle. On the landing, just behind a closet door, was the elderly neighbor. He'd sat down, confused and unable to find his cane. He was not hurt. He was frightened and stubborn in a way that needed gentle hands rather than orders. Carlos reached him, speaking low, and guided him into an arm that felt sure. He helped him down the steps with the kind of patience that is learned when you know another person's life might depend on the steadiness of your hands. When they reached the street, the crowd met them with a swell of worry that turned into collective applause, not of celebration, but of relief. People reached out to touch the neighbor's arm, to check the blanket held about his shoulders. For a moment, it was as if the whole block had exhaled together, the sound of breathing rising like a new beat. And then there was another sound, a sharp, precise voice from the head of the emergency crew, asking everyone to move further back. The edge of the block had become too crowded. Vehicles had to be kept clear. The firefighters, with a magnetism that pulls like gravity, drew people along into designated folds. They established a perimeter and warned against re-entry. They moved with the authority that comes from training and experience. Carlos tried to step aside into anonymity again. He tried to blend into the line of witnesses, to dissolve back into the role of someone who had only done the right thing. But cameras had already found him. Friends' phones had made him a moving image, and his face, smeared with city dust, eyes bright with the light of adrenaline, was someone the street had recognized.
Questions were asked of him. He answered simply. His responses were spare and given with the humility of someone who had not set out to be applauded. In the faces around him he saw gratitude and fear in acute mix. A young woman who held a sleeping child put her hand on his sleeve and said, "Thank you," in a voice that broke like a small twig. An older man, eyes red, squeezed his shoulder and did not let go for a long instant. The crowd's appreciation landed like coins in a cup. It was immediate, messy, human. But there was still a hazard that now required technical intervention. Technicians were on their way to locate and shut off the gas. A large truck with the utility company's insignia pulled up. Men in neon vests moved with measured urgency. They had tools, clipped and heavy, and some of their procedures were the boring work of expertise that saves lives without pageantry. Valves, gauges, isolation. They moved to probe and measure and to determine whether the leak was steady, increasing, or dissipating.
Carlos waited, partly because he had no place else to be, and partly because his body stayed lodged in the attention of those around him. He felt the weight of the whole night's events like an ache between his shoulders. He had risked himself, yes, but the most precise acts were the small ones, deciding to knock on one more door, to stay until the last pajama-clad hand was guided down the stairs, to keep children from running back toward a memory of a lamp left ablaze. A technician signaled, then moved toward a manhole on the street that gave access to infrastructure nobody usually noticed. He opened it, and the neighborhood's underbelly breathed out. Pipes and old concrete and metal that smelled incongruously like distant iron. Men lowered meters and then looked at one another. They pointed, they discussed, technical language that settled over the crowd as inscrutable and necessary. The sirens and the human voices receded for a moment as the professional conversation took dominance. Carlos felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the building superintendent again. He put his head close and whispered something that was only for Carlos to hear. A gratitude made of fewer words, and a promise to make sure the building would be safer. Carlos nodded. He thought of his savings again, of the small sign he hoped to hang one day, and of the way the night had folded him into something bigger than a route on a phone. Then there was a smell change, an almost imperceptible shift, as if the air was letting go of a strain. The hiss had not stopped completely, but a pressure had been altered. A technician called out, and slowly, methodically, began steps that would lead to the isolation of the source. People edged back from the edge of their collective fear, and the crowd's shape relaxed like a muscle unclenching. But inside Carlos the adrenaline held, and he kept moving among people, making sure, checking, reassuring where he could. He had not intended to be photographed. He had not intended to move from one life and into the center of a dozen phones and timelines. But as he worked, a foreigner, a night worker, a man with calluses and a recipe notebook tucked in a pocket, his image began to spread. The first small clips, grainy and intimate, would be stitched together in the hours to come into a narrative the city would watch. For now, under the streetlights and beneath the pale eyes of the emergency crew, Carlos felt exhausted, in the way a body feels when it has given more than it took. He permitted himself to sit on a curb and rest his forearms on his knees. The taste of something metallic lingered at the back of his tongue, and the night's cold felt like a balm. Across the block, someone reached into a jacket and handed him a bottle of water. He accepted it with a nod that carried the country's long memory of migrants being seen by strangers in the smallest of gestures.
The bottle was a small hospitality, nothing like the gratitude he would later be offered in public ceremonies, but it was immediate and warm. The first responders moved closer to the building now, with instruments and a plan. They signaled the crowd to stand back, and then they worked with a quiet efficiency. A valve was identified. Someone tightened, someone measured. The hiss ebbed, and then, critically, it stabilized. Engineers spoke into radios, and then with each other, and the tone of command carried through the crowd. Cameras were still recording, hands still lifted, but the sharp edge of panic dulled into a cautious relief. Carlos felt his legs tremble. He had run farther and harder than he had ever that evening, and his shoulders were sore from the work of steadying hands and carrying small lives down stairwells. A paramedic approached him, no accusation, only check, asked if he was all right. He replied he was breathing, and that he needed only a moment. The paramedic pressed a gloved hand to his forehead, then stepped back satisfied. There were no dramatic injuries. There was exhaustion, the kind of bodily debt that pays itself back in slow hours of sleep and cups of tea. But the night was not over. A new sound threaded the block, the low hum of people comparing notes, of voices asking why this had happened, how it could have been avoided, whether anyone had known earlier and not said anything. Questions that would soon become headlines were moving, quiet and insistent, through the crowd. Someone started a video that ended up online within the hour. Someone else called a local news station. Their voice had a tremor that was part fear and part the hope that if this story was told, it might mean something.
Carlos sat and let the city wrap itself around the facts. He had done what needed doing. He had pushed against the forgetting that makes some labor invisible. He had helped move approximately 200 people away from danger into the cold safety of the street. He did not know in that sitting how many of those people he knew personally, or how many he might never see again. He felt only the knit of bodies around him and the ache that comes from having been at the center of something bigger than a single life. As officials continued their work, a cluster of neighbors approached to offer blankets and to ask if he had eaten. A woman pressed a paper bag in his hands with sandwiches that had been warmed by someone who had heard and responded. He accepted them with hands that shook a little and said nothing grand. He did not want to be the story in their mouths. He wanted only for the night to settle into something like order. Even as order returned, the night had changed something about the block's anatomy. People who had never exchanged more than a nod now hugged in the street. Some who had been invisible to each other acknowledged that they had looked away for too long.
The invisible became visible through a line of small acts, door knocking, hands extended, blankets passed. But though the immediate danger was being contained and the street had the slow breath of recovery, the arc of what would come next, fundraisers, news cycles, company responses, honors, remained partly unknown in that cool hour. People recorded, shared, and spoke. Phone clips multiplied. Opinions would harden and soften in the days ahead. The scaffolding of a public narrative was already being built, but the finish would not be placed in that moment. There were things about what had caused the leak, details about infrastructure, about maintenance histories, about whether warnings had been missed, that remained indefinito, technical and dry and outside the emotional frame of the street. Carlos pushed himself up from the curb. He knew in the bones under his skin that the night would follow him into everything he would do after. He walked through the small ring of people who called his name with thanks. He did not let their praise define the night. He tucked his hands into his jacket. He kept his voice low and his answers simple. If anyone asked what he wanted, he would talk, slowly, about a small restaurant one day, about the spice blends his mother taught him, about the possibility that a life's work might have a place where people came in and sat down and tasted something honest. He moved towards his bicycle when he realized his shift, in another life, had not ended. There were orders yet unmet, a route to finish, destinations with names and apartment numbers. The bike felt familiar under his palms like an extension of himself. He had not planned to be a landmark in anyone's memory. He had planned only to be steady. As he mounted and started to pedal away, a woman called out from the crowd, simple words of thanks that lifted and spilled into the night, and a phone clicked, catching that frame again. A man with a knapsack, a tired smile, the reflective glare of a city lamp. That image would travel. For the moment, however, it was the city's late hour, and the residue of adrenaline and the thin curve of relief. He had not yet seen the morning light of consequences. The hit of the night was immediate, an evacuation of approximately 200 people, a swift, chaotic courage, a technician's slew sealing of a valve, but the larger story of how institutions would respond, how corporate policies would intersect with human action, how a crowd's gratitude would become headlines and crowdfunding pages, would come later and in different voices. Tonight, his hands still smelled faintly of spice and the city, and he rode through streets that now knew his silhouette. The echo of shoes on steps followed him down an avenue that glowed with orange sodium lights. He pedaled not because he had to go back to an order, but because the motion itself was a kind of compulsion, forward, away, toward the ordinary tasks that stitch a life together.
The city held its breath and then exhaled slowly, the lights of windows reasserting themselves like a quiet reprieve. He passed a storefront where a poster was being printed in someone's head before it existed. Thank you. He passed a truck that would later be labeled in 1,000 tweets. He passed the lamplight and kept going. The camera angles that had followed him would later be edited, voiced, and replayed. Neighbors would speak to reporters. The utility company would release statements of protocols, and a small public outcry would pressure corporate hands to act. A social media page would appear with the impulse to help. Funds would begin to collect, some in modest amounts, some in sums that made the idea of a restaurant look less like a far-off dream and more like a possibility. A company that worked through delivery apps would place its own administrative judgment on the night, and that judgment would be questioned. Some actions would be suspended and later reconsidered. Details of those administrative moves would spin into headlines, then into commentary. The arc of public recognition would bend towards civic honors and offers that would complicate as much as they celebrated. But none of those headlines had yet been written. What remained under the streetlights as Carlos rode away was the vivid knowledge that a single person could tilt the balance in a block. that invisible labor could become the axis of saving others, and that courage sometimes shows itself in the simplest decision: to knock, to shout, to go. The night kept its own counsel for a few more minutes. People remained outside in clusters, wrapped in blankets, comparing notes and watching as the emergency crews methodically worked. Carlos glanced back once, then again, and for an instant the block seemed to thrum with the soft light of small mercies. He had evacuated approximately 200 people that night. The number would later become a headline. For now, it was a quiet, staggering fact that made the rest of him feel both small and large at once. He rode into the dark with a pocket that hummed with the weight of what had happened. The night had not yet declared its final verdict. The story that would make him visible to a city was only beginning to form. There would be questions to ask and answers to parse. For Carlos, the immediate truth was uncluttered. People were safe for the moment. Hands that had been invisible had pushed others toward safety, and in his chest an odd mix of fatigue and purpose settled like a steady pulse. He pedaled under a row of trees that threw skeletal shadows across the pavement, thinking of the small stove in his apartment that had never worried him before, of the taste of peppers and warm tortillas, of the money in his pocket meant for a sign above a door. He thought too of the neighbor he'd helped down the stairs, and of the child he had reassured. He thought of the way the city had looked at him, briefly and seen.
He kept moving, not because the work was over, but because living a life means moving forward, even after the night asks everything of you. Behind him, the scene on the block continued to unfold. Tape tightened, radios clicked, lights blinked off in stairwells as technicians declared areas secure, voices softened into procedural language. People began to drift back to their apartments with the uneasy decision about when to re-enter and what would be different. A few remained outside, wrapped and talking about what had happened, as if to anchor it into reality. Carlos turned a corner and the street noise swallowed the hush of the evacuation. For a long block he rode alone, with the city's soft electricity humming around him. The night had changed him, but not because he wanted it to be changed, because it had asked him to act when action mattered most. The rest of the story, the public honors, the social media campaigns, the offers and the controversies, would arrive in their own time. For now, under the anonymous glow of the street lamp, he pedaled toward the simple chore of finishing his deliveries, and the complicated hope of a future where his name might hang above an oven, where the invisible could be made visible on purpose. The sun came up slow and orange the next morning, and the block that had been a single tense note in the night's symphony had become a story the whole city could hum. Clips from that cold hour threaded through feeds, a man in a knapsack moving through doorways, people wrapped in blankets on curves, firefighters working under a street lamp's tired spill. The clip that had caught Carlos in motion, his breath fogging in the cold, his jacket flecked with dust, moved through timelines like a stone skipping water, each skip making a new ripple. This account centers on the gas leak and the evacuation of approximately 200 people that night. Some specifics of infrastructure and timing remain indefinito, but the human arc is plain. An ordinary worker acted, and an ordinary neighborhood was saved. Details about valves, maintenance histories, or the precise technical cause are part of ongoing investigations. Those parts were not the evening's moral center. The center was a set of choices made under pressure. By mid-morning, the crowd of neighbors had dispersed back to apartments and to makeshift arrangements. Some families stayed with relatives, others opened temporary hotel rooms provided by sympathetic strangers and a few local businesses. Blankets that had been given out were folded and left in piles near stoops. A stray stuffed animal was reunited with a child's hand. The utility company and city crews continued to test and monitor lines. Their work was slow and exact, and their language, valves, pressure checks, isolation, filled civic press releases without offering the kind of immediate human relief citizens needed. Journalists arrived in small, steady streams, microphones bobbing like reeds in a wind. The camera angles were efficient. The block, the emergency tape, the reflective jackets, and always the man with the knapsack who had not been a subject before that night. Reporters found neighbors who had seen the first knocks on doors, who could remember the hiss and the smell like a bad memory that wouldn't fully settle. Members of the television crews tucked microphones toward faces still red from the night, and in the weave of live reporting, one thing became clear. People wanted to understand how someone with no official badge had become the first line of defense. Carlos, who preferred to stay out of the camera's span, found himself followed. A local station sent a reporter to the small cafe near his route. The proprietor, already aware of the night's events, pointed the reporter to the man in the back who had warmed a sandwich and then walked out into the cold. He agreed, awkwardly, to a short interview on the stoop. He spoke with the same plainness he had used at the doorways, not to be elevated, not to be the subject of accolades, but to explain a simple sequence of actions. He kept his answers short. He insisted on what mattered, that people had been helped to safety.
The video of him knocking on doors and guiding people out got reshared, enlarging his face to a scale the neighborhood had never given him. Comments multiplied: gratitude, astonishment, anger at institutions that seemed slow, and support. Someone started a GoFundMe that afternoon with one sentence: "For the delivery driver who evacuated our block." The page filled with small donations at first, and then with sums that began to shape an idea. This was not neutral attention, it was public investment in the man who had moved first. In the swirl of coverage, a corporate decision landed like a clumsy stone. The delivery app Carlos worked for placed his account on hold pending an internal review. The platform's policy, executed without context in a short statement, meant he could not log on, accept orders, or access the small pool of money that his routes generated. For someone who had been saving toward a restaurant window, it was a shock. The administrative tape cut into the same hands that had cut night into routes. People noticed. Online outrage gathered the shape of a storm. The clip of the man knocking on doors and rallying neighbors had become a moral provocation. If his work made him visible to the whole city, another set of eyes saw corporate policy as an affront in that visibility. Opinion pieces pointed to the tension between algorithmic labor practices and the lived moral obligations of human beings. Comment threads threaded profanity and praise together. Fundraising totals climbed in sympathetic jumps. Under that pressure, the company issued a follow-up statement, a revision of the earlier action, a promise to review with more context, and then within days, a reversal and an extraordinary public award.
The company reinstated Carlos's account, apologized for the haste of the initial administrative step, and issued a payment, a $50,000 bonus intended as immediate relief and as recognition for his role that night. The amount was both symbolic and practical. It was coverage for a dream given a sudden nudge toward possibility. The company called it a gesture and a goodwill award. Critics called the timing performative. The public, meanwhile, largely cheered that the man who had been penalized was made whole. There were other funds that arrived too. Donations through the GoFundMe spilled into the thousands, then tens of thousands. Friends and strangers alike wrote notes. "We want to help with your restaurant," one read. "You kept our children safe," another said. He accepted the money with the cautious generosity of someone who knew the weight of public attention. He insisted on practical uses, paying overdue rent, ensuring neighbors who had had to move temporarily were covered for short stays, putting a bit aside for the small storefront he had drawn on napkins for years. When asked whether he would keep the bonus, his answer was quick and steady. He would use it to build the life he'd been saving for, and to help those who had been hit hardest in the immediate aftermath. There was an awkward privacy to the sudden fame. People wanted to tell his story. He wanted to live it. Invitations came from local politicians, from neighborhood associations, and from producers who wanted a segment. He accepted a few small interviews and declined larger offers. He met with the building superintendent and with a neighbor-led committee focused on improving emergency signage and access on the block. He signed petitions to improve infrastructure inspections, petitions whose effect would be indefinido in the short term, but that gave the community a sense of trying. City officials moved cautiously but with visible attention. The mayor wrote a short letter of thanks and invited Carlos to a modest ceremony where local leaders would recognize the courage witnessed on the block. At that ceremony, the City Hall hallway warmed with sunlight and reporters lingering at the edges. A medal of civic appreciation was pinned to a jacket too thin for winter. The mayor spoke of bravery that comes from the heart of our neighborhoods, and the applause that followed felt like a collective exhale. Carlos accepted the honor in his plain way. He tipped his head. He said nothing of himself beyond gratitude for everyone who helped, and he asked that the attention be used to make places safer for other people. Long-form profiles followed. A magazine wrote about his childhood in Guatemala, about his mother's cooking, about how recipes travel across continents in a worker's knapsack. The piece traced the lineage of his skill, the rhythm of slicing peppers, the patience in making dough, into the vision for a restaurant where flavors would carry stories. It said his saving had always been measured in folded bills and small frugality. It described his hands, calloused, precise, used both to lift pans and to steady a frail neighbor down a flight of stairs. But not everything that grows in public attention is simple gratitude. There were questions and debates. Activists pointed to the moment as evidence of a broader problem. People relied on invisible labor until it became necessary to notice. Labor advocates proposed reforms, and op-eds debated whether the night had highlighted systemic neglect more than individual heroism. Carlos, for his part, navigated these currents with the low-key humility that had been his armor. He was not uninterested in the broader questions. He simply avoided the role of spokesman. He wanted, if possible, to return to the kitchen and to the work of making a life. The neighborhood's response deepened in other ways. Community groups organized a regular soup program at the corner church, offering discounted or free meals for seniors who'd been displaced temporarily.
The small grocery at the block's corner set aside a credit line for people coping with unexpected hotel nights or laundry costs. These were not grand solutions, but they were proofs. The night had taught the block to think, briefly, like a body, where one sore part required the rest to be attentive. Months later, with permits secured and a small loan matched by the savings and the donations, Carlos found a narrow storefront with a window that caught the sun at noon. The space smelled faintly of old paint and optimism. He signed the lease with hands that were not entirely steady and began the work that transforms a dream into a daily economy. Counters measured, a menu pared down to its most honest offerings, a hood installed. Friends from the neighborhood came by at odd hours to help with painting and cleanup, offering hands that had been neighbors during the evacuation and allies in the slow labor of opening a small business. When the restaurant opened, it was nothing like a stadium. There were no velvet ropes, no formal ribbon-cutting broadcast nationwide, only a modest line of people from the block and from nearby neighborhoods. The first weeks were about the miracle of a working stove and the satisfaction of seeing faces light at a familiar spice. He served dishes that his mother had taught him, and he taught his staff, some former patrons, some newly hired, that the place was meant to be a shelter as much as a business, a place where community could meet and where food would be honest and direct. He kept a small ledger, a note in the back of his register listing an extra meal a week to give away to someone who could not afford it. He insisted that a day each month would be dedicated to discounted meals for seniors. The neighborhood responded with loyalty. People who had been saved that night came back to eat and to tell the stories that make a place's memory thicker.
They would sometimes stand at the counter afterward, still slack with the theatrical memory of that night, and they would tell him, quietly, how their child had slept in a different apartment because of what he had done. They would reach for his sleeve and say his name, and the way he received it, awkward, embarrassed, grateful, made the owning of that name gentle. Years later, the city dedicated a small plaque on a bench in a pocket park near the block. The plaque did not use phrases like hero. It used quieter words, in gratitude to those who make safety through simple, brave acts. Families planted wildflowers nearby. A photo of the bench with people sitting softly on it circulated among neighborhood newsletters. At the annual block party, they announced that the restaurant would sponsor a food table for anyone who couldn't pay the entrance fee. The gesture became a regular part of the event, small and steady, like the man who had inspired it. Carlos never believed the night had made him exceptional. He remembered the weight of that truth, that the decision to act is sometimes the only defining thing between destruction and survival. He kept telling that to interviewers who asked what had trained him to move as he did. He spoke of responsibility, of neighborliness, of the fact that everyone carries a capacity for courage that is sometimes only revealed by circumstance. He would say, with a smile that folded into a reserve, that it had been the right thing to do, and that anyone in the street could have done it. Public perception shifted, then settled. The viral frenzy cooled into a steady interest in community stories. The company's initial misstep became a footnote in the broader conversation about gig work and human dignity. For Carlos, the money that had been given was not a finishing line but a starting point, a down payment on a small front window, on an oven that would warm neighborhood winters for years. There were, of course, quiet costs that did not fit neatly into press cycles. He had lost some sleep for months, waking at small noises and checking burners as though the smell of the night might return. The adrenaline that had sustained him then faded into a new kind of alertness, an awareness that life could pivot in a half-breathed second. He learned to sit with that and to let the day bring back the comforts of routine. When nights were slow and his stove was off, he would sometimes walk the block and exchange small talk with the neighbors who had once gathered under street lamps. The relationships were not all saccharine. They carried the complicated human weight of a community that had been through an acute crisis and recalibrated itself. One afternoon, months after the leak, a woman with a toddler stopped in front of the restaurant and, without fanfare, pressed a small envelope into his hand. Inside was a scribbled note of thanks and a gift card worth less than a week's wages.
He accepted it as he accepted other tokens, with the sense that gratitude is not a currency to be hoarded, but a rhythm to be honored. He used the card to buy extra coffee for his staff that day. At the start of each anniversary of the event, the block observed a small, informal ritual. People would gather briefly near the plaque, share some food, Carlos always contributed a pot of something, and remember the practical decisions that had kept them safe. The stories did not become myths. They remained practical recollections. He knocked on my door. We smelt the gas. We stood outside until they said it was safe. The ritual was less about celebrity and more about the memory measures that neighborhoods keep, the ways people anchor themselves to one another. The media spotlight receded, as it always does, but the structural conversations it had provoked did not vanish.
City inspectors reviewed more frequent checks in certain neighborhoods. A local nonprofit used the story as an example in a campaign to increase funding for building safety education. Schools added basic emergency awareness into their community outreach programs, not instructions for vigilante action, but an emphasis on clear communication and the importance of calling officials. Through it all, Carlos kept cooking. He still woke early, though now he sometimes took a moment to sit with his staff and drink coffee before the rush. He still repaired his bicycle at odd hours. He still kept a savings jar under the counter labeled with his dream. And he kept a habit he had always held. When a bell chimed and someone came to the door with a small emergency, he listened first and then acted with what he had: knowledge, muscle, and the moral fuel that comes from choosing to help. Once, toward the end of a long week, a young man walked into the restaurant and sat quietly in a corner. He did not order at first. He watched the hobs and the way the line moved. When Carlos came over, the man reached for him and placed a simple card on the table. On it was a single line: "Because of you, we are okay." There was no need for more speech. Carlos folded the card and let the warmth of it sit with him. He thought of the night as a net that had held people up. He thought about how fragile presence can be, and how much it costs nothing to show up. In the years that followed, the night took its proper place in people's memories, a point of reference, an example of neighborly courage, a story parents told their children in the way people tell of small moral good. It became a cautionary tale about infrastructure and a hopeful tale about community. People who had been evacuated sometimes came back to the restaurant and sat at the counter, not to rehash the danger, but to eat warm food and be part of the neighborhood's life. They told new stories, and those stories braided with old ones until the block's memory was richer.
If there was a single abiding lesson Carlos would repeat if asked, it was the simplicity of his own calculus. See someone in need, do what you can. He never offered himself as an exception. He offered the idea that ordinary laborers carry with them the capacity to act in ways that confer dignity, and that dignified labor deserves recognition, not only when it becomes news, but as a daily posture. And for those watching this now, wherever you are, the final thought is quiet and direct. The people who keep our cities running often look invisible until a moment renders them essential. See them, value them. When you hear a story like this, of a cook, a delivery driver, a neighbor, remember that the moral question is not whether we would be brave, but whether we are willing to notice others before we are called upon to applaud. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more stories like this.